Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're now in my 10th week of lecturing once a day on topics from my books Great Problems of Philosophy and Physics, which is the second in my series of books. This one came out a little over a year ago. And I've chosen a topic from chapter 7 of this book. Let's take a look at that book for a moment. The chapter is called God and Immortality. What I'm going to argue today is an explanation of how God and immortality fit into my view of the great problems in philosophy in the first place, but also how thinking about philosophy in terms of information instead of language and the clever arguments, the rhetoric, the dialectic, the method of convincing people by persuasion of ideas, all of those are very important elements in the history of philosophy, the history of thought, how it is we know who we are, and so forth. That's been the tradition. And my new work, my goal, is to explain that there is another way of thinking about problems from all the way from the beginning of the universe down to our current thoughts, what it is we're trying to understand about who we are as human beings, and what is the place of life in the universe on this little planet near the sun, with very little sign of it elsewhere, and more importantly, our minds, our souls, our spirit, our self, all the words which humanity's traditionally described individuals as having these things that are the basis, the seat of our character, when much of modern philosophy has turned away from this romantic kind of thinking, this thinking that we are more than just our matter. Ever since the early 19th century, we've had a tradition of what's called positivism, later empiricism, the idea that unless you can measure it and touch it, there is nothing there otherwise. And so there began an attack which really culminated in the early 20th century on notions like William James' psychology, which describes us as having a mind. Just in the early 20th century, John Watson developed behaviorism, which B.F. Skinner at Harvard made into an enormously successful school of psychology for the next 50 years, until it was sort of debunked and replaced by something equally empirical, equally reductionist, equally, they say, physicalist. That is to say, it was called cognitive science, and it basically argued that the mind is an illusion, that the brain is a computer, and that humans are machines seem to have been accepted, although there were a few people who reacted against that extreme. Eliminative materialism was called, that there's absolutely nothing but matter in the universe, and matter is following laws of physics, which in turn explain all of chemistry, which is reducible to physics, and then even biology. Our lives, ourselves as living things, are reducible to biology, and the mind or the brain is somehow going to in turn be reducible to the fact that there must be biological laws just as there are chemical laws, just as there are physical laws, and so forth. Now that's been a very successful set of academic disciplines which interconnect and provide a story that we are really not creative, free agents with responsibility, but that the moral responsibility we exhibit to one another most of the time is to be understood as a consequence of the evolution of life and the evolution of human beings and our minds, following basically some sort of evolutionary laws, so that we are in fact determined beings, in the sense that everything happening is happening to us, that those things that we think we are making happen, that's just an illusion. Consciousness itself is questionable or explained as a process that was evolved into the kind of thinking beings we are, but that there is no ability to have a break in the laws of science so as to allow or imagine that we are in fact beings who are thinking up new ideas, alternative possibilities, as William James called them, and that we are actually the authors of our lives, that we are, when we choose to do something, it's because we chose that it happens. So there's a very large school, and we've talked about them a few times before. There are some there who then say that that deterministic process that explains everything going on from the beginning of the universe to life on Earth and to our work as human beings, that it's all just totally determined and so forth, may not mean that we should interpret moral responsibility as a kind of way of looking at a sort of freedom worth having, a free will worth having, according to Dan Dennett. But many of Dennett's colleagues in philosophy are quite pessimistic about this description, and that if his description of things as happening under various laws, evolutionary processes beyond our control, they conclude that no, we don't have moral responsibility. How can you punish anyone or how can you hold a person accountable if what's happening to us is happening to us, that we are not the authors of our lives? Well, in the context of all of this attempt to understand how we fit into the universe, from the creation, and I argue and I will defend that there was a creation, but I see no evidence of a creator behind the creation. Instead, I'll show you how amazing it is that despite the second law of thermodynamics that says everything gets more disorderly, everything heads towards a thermal equilibrium of everything distributed in a chaotic, disorderly way, which is the conclusion of classical mechanics and the theory of thermodynamics in the 19th century. It suggested that the universe is running down, and there's no way anything interesting can happen in the universe except that which was set in motion at the beginning. Most 19th century, many 20th century thinkers argued that everything in the universe today must be wearing out, and we're going to wind up dead. In the long run, we're all dead, as a great economist said. But today I am trying to defend a position which shows how things like objects, which are interesting objects as opposed to chaotic and objects, interesting objects can be created by the forces of physics once the universe has expanded to a giant size where there's plenty of room for interesting things to reduce the entropy or the disorder locally and create orderly objects like our planet, the sun that shines on us, the galaxies in which we go around every 100,000 years around this huge galaxy, and all the many other galaxies in the universe. All of them came into existence at a time that we can now identify. And before they came into existence, there was very little in the form of macroscopic, very large information structures in the universe. It was growing dark. It goes back to a thing we now see as the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is actually looking back at that early moment, a few 100,000 years, when atoms formed, and suddenly the universe became transparent to light, to photons that can travel the complete distance across the universe from just a few 100,000 years after the beginning, and they come down to us today. I'm going to explain that as a creation process which has nothing of a mind in it, nothing intellectual in it, just random happenings where the density of matter is a little larger than somewhere else, and those condensational or dense areas which can condense into things like the galaxies and the stars and the planets just happen at random. When we look out at the universe, they're distributed. Some sign of clumping because of larger structures which are clusters of galaxies or superclusters, and sort of large arcs of area where there are more galaxies than in others, as if something exploded and caused a great hole in space. We know a great deal about the giant universe, but everything going on in that time was a consequence of physical laws like the nuclear forces, the electrodynamic forces that, and quantum properties that put atoms together, and then the great gravitational forces, incredibly weak, but when you deal with huge amounts of matter over fantastic volumes of the universe, they then formed into the interesting things we see in the sky, and in particular our own Milky Way galaxy, which is huge and has billions of stars in it, and ourselves and so forth. So the second stage, though, I'm going to try to describe to you is the acceptance of the theory of evolution, which is an extremely well-established theory. No theory is ever proven logically, and so it has its critics. There are those who think that we are so complex an organism that it's impossible for us to have formed merely by chance, merely by random variation and natural selection, by a blind variation, not directed at all, and then a selective retention of some of those characteristics from evolved species to species to species, which get more and more and more elaborate, complex, and interesting, frankly. So after my discussion of creation, which was only physical forces, we get to a phase of evolution where information structures, which is what I call something like a star. We can see it's a clearly, beautifully, spherically symmetric object. After that passive type of object in the universe, there appeared a little proto-life form on the planet Earth, and proto-life forms reproduce themselves using, really duplicating or replicating the information in themselves as they grow and occupy more of the surface of the Earth. And the story of replicating that information, the story of making mistakes in the replication, which sometimes improve things, and we have a moving up the evolutionary scale, and it's a long while before we get to cells, even at today's sort of lowest life form, plus the little virus, which has no shell, no cell. All of that now I describe as active information structures, because here the information content in one life form, when it duplicates itself, it's using that information so as to figure out, like a blueprint for another copy of itself, or even an enhanced and improved copy of itself, where the enhancement is not under the control of something external to that life. It isn't like there's a finger coming down from heaven and pushing around the atoms into that molecule, which now is a big enough molecule to replicate itself. So I describe a second stage of the formation of the universe. We'll come to the end of it after my talk on God and immortality. But basically, I describe the creation phase, the first stage of the universe, from atoms up to galaxies, stars, and planets, as a kind of creation, but without a creator. There's no evidence of somebody finger in the plan or moving things around. Everything is happening under the forces of nature, but to some considerable degree at random. When you get to the second stage, where information structures duplicate themselves on our planet and our proto-life and grow into the living things we see all over the planet, wonderful things, beautiful things, as Darwin described them. That phase is active control of the evolutionary changes under the control of the intrinsic information in each and every one of the living things on the planet. And they're all involved and all inter-revolved. Some will reproduce the others and become dominant all over the surface of the earth and so forth. It's a fascinating story, but it's an active process, that one, under the control of the information content of living things. And I describe that where the first is creation without a creator. I believe this second stage is best thought of as evolution without a designer. No sign of intelligent design, despite the hopes for those who want some sort of supernatural agent overseeing the whole thing, so as to make it as beautiful as it is. And we humans do regard nature as a beautiful thing, and we sometimes can't believe that it could have come about by accident. But my second phase is evolution without a designer. And in the third stage, I'm describing it as a mind, that is to say, a human mind, the one that's interesting. All the animals have minds, and they have a lot of our characteristics. They feel pain all the way down. They make decisions, and they learn from their experiences, all of the things that make us what we are. And those things that make us what we are above and beyond the material body that we have, beyond our brain. The brain, though, has an ability to embody a mind. And the problem with that mind, as others would see it, it's immaterial, because information is fundamentally material, whereas matter and energy are the material out of which we are built. The thing that we're doing when we think is working with abstract information, not to neglect the feelings and desires and so forth that we are experiencing as we grow, which inform ourselves as beings that are driven, that have purposes, and make decisions between alternative possibilities and so forth. This whole complexity of what our psychological selves are is my argument is that it's a mind that's immaterial with a soul, but it's not an immortal soul, because when we die, our information perishes unless we've externalized it, put it out into the environment somewhere, for example, in my case, in the form of ideas, which I hope other people will be interested in the future, as a deep explanation of how we all got here and where we fit into the universe. Once again, this third stage involves information, which is why I call myself the information philosopher. But here the information now is the abstract information, which is our thoughts, is something that is a kind of much higher level, in my sense of it, than the information that life uses to reproduce itself. Because now we have human beings taking an active agential role in the future of themselves, ourselves, which is very powerful and sometimes very worrisome, because the question is, are we going to be good caretakers of life in general that led to us in particular? Are we likely to do something really stupid because we have been for many thousands of years a kind of a homicidal species? There's been a lot of death and destruction in order for one group, one tribe, one person even, to take control and power over others. There's a massive problem of our social rules and whether we behave them and believe them and obey them and so forth or not. Something I do hope to explore in the future, but I'm no expert on the organization of society. What I am is a scientist, a cosmologist. I've also been an inventor and an entrepreneur and a publisher. I built tools to allow people to self-publish. the first desktop publishing program. I'm fundamentally an idea person who like to think of new possibilities which will empower others. One of my great interests has been to build tools that help communities communicate. Students getting filmmaking equipment that allow them to make movies, and in recent decades, video equipment to allow them to make video programming, podcasting, for example, initially audio, but now video, and what I'm doing here with this webcast. I've had a wonderful, lucky life of building new things, new tools, and then handing many of them on to students at schools hereby or other media institutions or arts institutions. But now I've turned to this notion of webcasting and taking my books, my website, which has now grown quite huge with some 1,500 pages, and my webcasting now to tell people about this work. And I must say this particular problem is that I'm going to discuss today from my Great Problems book is a powerful one, and one I've thought about a lot all my life. So let's say we switch into that for a moment, and let me bring up what? I'll switch over to my left screen, which I've got behind me right now. I guess that's all I need to do. And look at today's blog entry. My blog is i-phi.org. I should get a little lower third here. I can give you a lower third with my email address, for example. And I should build another one with my blog address, because every morning before I lecture, I write up a blog page with a title and some selected paragraphs, usually taken from the chapter in the book. In this case, my Great Problems book, chapter 7. So let me turn back to the book. I like this idea of being able to see down on what we're doing and pick out the words with you. I think they're nice and legible. This is an important tool I designed with a camera up above me, over my head, up this way. So I basically observed that most of the world's religions have some concept of gods, or a God with a capital G often, with some notable exceptions such as Buddhism. So there are a lot of Asian, Indian religions that have a different view, and there were also in ancient times thinkers who thought basically God was the whole universe, and they're called pantheists and so forth. Anyway, theologians claim to have discerned the essential attributes of a monotheistic God, such as omniscience, that is to say, perfect foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen, omnipotence, unlimited power, and if a God is going to be given the task of building the entire universe, we are really talking about unlimited power here. Indeed, the power of manipulating the universe from outside seems to suggest something at least as powerful as the universe getting built. Just as when we build something, it takes our human energy to build it, and when we're done, it's something just built. It may or may not be as big as we are. And then there's the notion of omnipresence, that this God must be present everywhere. Some views say, no, God stopped working at the beginning and left it for other processes or laws of nature. And then many religions have an idea that God is perfectly good, omnibenevolence we might call it here, and that the existence of this God is both eternal and necessary. Many of the proofs of God usually started with attempting to say that God had to be and could not be, because in order to be a perfect being, he would have to have, or should be she these days, a property of being necessarily existent. If otherwise, the God would be less than perfect. Wonderful sort of getting the conclusion out of the stuff you put into the argument. So let me push this screen up a little bit. I've sort of had some thoughts over the years in studying religions, and I have probably the order of 30 or 40 books on different religions and studied many of them at different times, including my very first course in philosophy at Brown University with Kurt Dukas in the philosophy of religion. And one finds that, I suggest that there could be a simple test of the revealed truth of these various attributes, okay? The idea is we figure out that there are these truths and they've been revealed to us, and where best to look for these revelations than in these attributes, specifically the visions by inspired thinkers that have no empirical evidence, but the visions do give them some look, some appearance of God. Although these visions are in the realm of, quote, pure ideas, we can say that if every world religion agreed completely on the attributes of God, it would increase their believability at a minimum. But as it is, the comparative study of religions with the incredible diversity of their claims renders the idea of any particular one of these gods as implausible as a Santa Claus, who's another character that basically is made up as someone keeping an eye on us all the time to see whether we've been good or bad and so forth. And that has a great deal to do with what the purpose, it seems to be, of inventing a God has been for human beings. Let me switch back to my other screen here, and let's take it to full screen because I can perhaps see what's in it a little bit better. I also want to perhaps bring it up over here, and this is my blog. Give me a moment. Here we go. I'm switching from this old post to the current post on my ifi.org. I'll just get rid of that and say go. And here's the current version. The reason this one is nice is because I can actually select the text and highlight that text, and I can bring this a little bit bigger so you can see it more easily. That's probably enough right there. So I'm saying at the present time, arguments like mine will carry very little weight with the believers in any religion, right? Most of them have little exchange of knowledge with those of other faiths. Now in the West, in Europe in particular, America and so forth, we've been a melting pot not only of different peoples from different nations, but we brought in all kinds of religious ideas. So there is a lot more interchange of ideas with people in the Western world. And now what I should be doing right here is bringing up this one here so I have my noted area. But basically, few religions have a kind of an outreach to try to understand what everyone else is saying. From time to time, we've had these eclectic kind of religions. The Sufi were an example in Islam. The Baha'i, several groups who, the universal universalist, or Unitarian, I guess, grew out of Christianity, but rejected these ideas of a Trinity and tried to focus on more an encompassing view of the relationship between a God, if they believe in that at all, and make religion into something much broader and so forth, much broader. But my point I'm trying to make here is, though there's been very little exchange of knowledge, this could change, and I believe the reason for the change could well be the development of this internet that we're using for me to talk to you today. And especially because of the smartphones, which, as we speak, have just passed half the world's population is carrying a little smartphone, which they could look into any ideas that appeal to them or that they discover. And I am, I'm sure, considered somewhat subversive, but my belief is that once young people especially, before they've been heavily indoctrinated, if they can get a smartphone at that young age, may come to have a much better appreciation of who we are, how we fit into the universe, what's the nature of reality, and so forth. And I hope they'll come to be satisfied with a view that science has provided us that tells us a great deal more about why we're here, without providing, sadly, some of the hopes and dreams of having a nice guardian above who's watching over all of our actions. And of course, to an individual, there's a great deal of comfort may come, especially in times of distress, in a family when some great loss occurs and so forth. To have the idea that someone is watching is a very powerful human desire, because I won't be able to provide that, or the view of the universe that we now know, from the creation without a creator to the evolution of life without a designer, and now to this mind, soul, self, spirit, ghost in the machine that I'm talking about here, without a immortality, which does so much for those who are desperately worried about the fact that they're going to die. Well, you know, we all are going to die, it seems to me. The question then is, what would it be to say that we continue to live in a, quote, afterlife, or what would it be to say that that soul, which I believe we have a soul, I'm trying to identify that soul, and in a way I stand opposed to most of my colleagues in materialistic, reductionist, empiricist, naturalist science and philosophy, who think they can explain everything without anything like an immortal, an immaterial, say, soul. My vision of the soul is one in which we have all of our experiences recorded embodied in our material brain. But those abstract ideas are the things that remind us or reproduce, play back our old experiences so as to give us the context of any current experiences. That's a very simple idea. If we've had no experiences, we start as that tabula rasa that the empiricists like Locke and Hume thought things were in a mind, then we don't understand anything that we're seeing. Now, it turns out that's wrong, because there's a good deal of genetically encoded kind of experiences that our ancestors had, and before our human ancestors, all of our other living ancestors, species from which we descend, they've all given us aspects of our being. For example, the emotions, the passions, are the sensation, the ability for sensations to hurt us or give us pleasure, has encoded much of those may have been encoded genetically. We may not have we didn't learn to feel pain. Certainly higher animals down to rather lower organisms all feel pain, and probably pleasure. And so that may have come to us genetically, transferred between the generations simply by mechanisms of heredity in our DNA. But the great thing about the human DNA, as opposed to other animals and earlier types of living things like the insects, we all have about the same amount of DNA within there's a wide range, but the total amount of bits of information there are not that enormously different. But the earlier forms of life passed on to their descendants all of what one needed to be, for example, perhaps say a butterfly or an ant. An ant seems to come into existence with all the abilities of an adult ant. Can do everything it needs to do, get on with life, doesn't have to learn anything. It has got to have a built-in way of following clues to where the food chain is, but basically everything is built in. Whereas when you get to human DNA, same amount of DNA, but much less of the DNA is encoded with what we need to be as an adult person. And the rest of this DNA, okay, the rest of it seems to be just ready to learn new things to be. This is the important difference, thinking about us as information. We have been given a lot of ability to learn new information through new, unique experiences, which to me means we are beings that can create new information. And once we learn that new information, we don't encode it in our DNA. Nothing comes down from experience back into DNA. That's the central dogma, that the DNA talks to the messenger RNA, and that talks and creates the proteins, which are enzymes, and that's more or less the big story of what's happening. But because much of our DNA is just built to create this thing that can learn and can record experiences and then understand the world, find meaning in the context of whatever past experiences we have, now we've got a human being that's capable of learning and creating that learning for the next generation and the next and the next. So all of our knowledge, all of our capacity as human beings is something created and then transmitted through the generations, not in any way genetically, but by parents teaching children, which is why the whole educational process that we have and for our young lives is such a critical, important, essential thing that we have to have as human beings. It's sad that only a relatively small part of the world really devotes itself to this process of educating. The young, mothers have always done it mostly. Fathers do it occasionally, and sometimes to enormously wonderful effect, creating creative, valuable young children coming up into the world. Anyway, what I've got to do now is look at the position of God in our thinking in chapter 7 of my book called Great Problems. And I'll also refer you to chapter, well, it's actually an appendix, I think, on the cosmic creation process. Let me give you a quick peek at that. Here's cosmic creation, which is that first big stage of creation without a creator. But then let me come back to beyond the arguments that there's a creation but no creator. I'd like to go to the kinds of creators that that most religions imagine to exist, okay? First, in theism, God is the creator and sustainer of the universe, okay? In deism, though, God is the creator, but not the sustainer of the universe. Now the universe is assumed to be running itself, following deterministic laws of motion. This is a very large, explains a large number of religious positions these days. But then this can be disappointing because they don't imagine God as being involved and taking care of not only the universe, but also taking care of all of us. Some religions don't think it's proper to pray and ask God for favors for oneself, but only for the community or for life in general. But there's a great loss to the apparent value of a God if God has no say in what's happening to us. So the open theism is a very interesting argument that denies that God's foreknowledge has already determined the future. Catholic Church in particular tries to say God knows everything you're going to do but has nothing to do with your doing it, which is a kind of absurd paradox, or something worse. Monotheism is the belief in the existence of one God or in the oneness of God. In pantheism, God is the universe itself, which is interesting. But the universe in our early stage of creation does not have any real interest in what's going on in the universe. Let me turn off our email. Now, polytheists think there are lots of gods, and for atheists, of course, there aren't any gods. Now, God is sometimes conceived as immaterial being, right? No body. I accept this. I think it's really the case. That's what God is, quintessentially an idea, pure information, like many of our ideas, like Newton's laws or arithmetic. Some think that an avatar of God has come to earth in the past. Indeed, many religions, especially Indian religions, but many others think that God has to have been a human figure. That's because, as some philosophers have noted over the centuries, that because the reason God looks like us is because we create God in our own image, not that God created us in his image. Some religions see God as a personal being answering human supplications and prayers, and a God intervening in human affairs is often thought to be the source of all moral norms. There are many who think that if we don't have a God, surely there's nothing like morality. And those attempts to situate morality or to build the foundation of morality, trying to understand what's best for human beings, seems rather self-interested, seems rather parochial. Why should norms, universal norms, depend on human beings? Humanism is a really wonderful set of ideas through the centuries. They've been generally very reasonable thinkers. The Unitarian Universalists, I think of themselves as secular humanists because they've set the God story aside to a great extent. But information philosophy, as we come to approach this problem, has a problem. Where do morals come from? If we are going to situate it, the most important thing going on, the creation of information. Where do values come from? Are there values beyond humanism? Well, ethicists today like to take it out to the whole planet and say life is the important fundamental good and we must respect all life. Then we're in a dilemma that we have to eat other life in order to keep ourselves alive, so we're in a difficult position to claim that we are the one who can say, we're the ones who could say, we are the universal good. We have to keep humans alive and in turn life alive. And we'll find in my work in the future in information philosophy that I want to move the basis for good in the universe out to the objective creation of information structures in the universe. And we're just a special case. We're the special case that actually knows what we're doing when we see the information structures. And a kind of moral law will be something as simple as preserve information as much as possible, considering we have to destroy it occasionally. We have to break the eggs to make the omelet, as often said, but we would always attempt to maintain and preserve information, especially information that's not easily replicated and made available everywhere. So logical proofs of God's existence are based on various of God's assumed attributes. And now that information philosophy and information physics has identified the essential attributes and properties of the cosmic creation process, I will propose that a new problem for theologians who want to work to explain things to the maximum, they will have to turn and consider the views of information philosophy and the creation of the universe we live in with their views of their own gods, which is a bit radical and maybe hubristic, but that's where I think we're going to come out if we try to build a philosophy that isn't simply a question of logical arguments, linguistic proofs which establish things in words and so forth, but I want philosophy to go to a deeper level of seeing exactly how the universe is working today and how it has been working for 14 billion years nearly, and what does that tell us about the nature of the universe, and what does it tell us about where we are, where's our place in this universe. So I'm going to basically come to the end of this page on my blog, which again I hope some of you will find. We're in the early days of my work in information philosophy. My website does have a lot of traffic and a lot of people using it, writing to me with emails. They do not yet know much about my lectures, although I've now put it on the home page, and I hope more people will find me. But frankly, at this point in time, we only have a few dozen people watching these lectures. You might say, why do I keep doing them if I don't even have a class as large as the classes I had years ago at Harvard? For one thing, the lectures all become stored permanently on YouTube and on Facebook, although as I look over at my screen controls, they did not transmit today to Facebook, but they are streaming on YouTube. Thankful for that. I've had lots of technical problems, I must tell you, in making this whole system be more reliable. I hope to be very reliable going into the future. But again, because I have a small audience watching, it's giving me the opportunity to frame my arguments. I then take those arguments back and rewrite my web pages and my forthcoming books. And so I slowly build up, and it may be some time before I have any significant interested following who would try to apply the ideas of information philosophy rather than language philosophy or logical positivism or reductionism to matter and all the efforts that I believe have not been successful in philosophy. So that, to me, I regard it as a scandal that academic philosophers who write about the subject of free will tell their students that there's no free will. They do not know that. They don't know exactly what free will is. Many of them just say, well, it's the same thing as moral responsibility. That's the traditional argument, that free will is moral responsibility. Well, those two are connected, but they are not identities. Freedom depends on the fact that we are able to do something that no God could prevent us from doing, and no God could be responsible for what we're doing. We are agents. We have minds that are immaterial. We have a soul that's mortal, but also a very important part of us, because the soul is the word that I think thinkers have used to describe ourselves as selves, with a character that's embedded in our soul, and that word has been considered an illusion, like consciousness and all of these things that academic philosophers now think they can just ignore. No, we can't imagine those things. I am reimagining those things in terms of immaterial information. And I hope to convince an awful lot of people, including people who hold on to these ideas simply because they were the traditional ideas, as we noted, sort of based on ideas handed down by the founders of the major religions. Okay, so modern cosmology, and that's not just me, confirms that the universe came into existence at a definite time in the past. And of course, this is a really amazing statement, 13.75 billion years ago. Although this does not imply the creator some religions want, it does confirm the creation process. And because this process continues today, and this is a very important point, indeed, we human beings are co-creators, at least of our world, then we can now say that the deists were wrong about a creative act at the beginning, followed by a mechanical clockwork universe tending to itself ever since. And so creationism in the sense of the universe, although that's often a word used with respect to evolution, just is not true. We are part of the creative process. And most importantly, we are responsible for creating the human presence on the planet today. In just 10,000 years, we've famously come from less than 1% of the mass, of the biomass, which is vertebrate. That singles us out from a lot of the plants and everything else. But on the terrestrial surface, on the Earth land, we went from less than 1% of the vertebrate biomass to 90% or thereabouts. Human beings and our animals are what are being counted here. The domesticated animals, our food stocks, ourselves, are now the most 90% of what's on the Earth surface. It's quite striking. Tells you just how powerful we've been. So the second of my three steps is just summarized here. What about the argument that we see evidence for intelligent design? A large number of people are producing this, and it's a very old idea called teleology, that the essence or idea of something must be there before the thing itself came into existence. Since all information structures, first the cosmological and then the biological, were not present as ideas before they emerged, and emergent is the key word, that life created itself, its growth, its evolutionary growth and change, then I argue that at least some of the peculiar specific information in living things did not pre-exist them. And so the existentialists who said existence precedes essence, as opposed to the so-called essentialists who argued teleologically that there must have been an idea of man before a man could exist. That's a mistake. And great thinkers from like Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre were basically correct in this respect. But then their idea that God is dead was to me an absurd idea. I've been sort of fascinated. My second of 3 philosophy classes at Brown after philosophy of religion was in existentialism, which was extremely popular in the 1950s, although it grew into more European faddish philosophical ideas like deconstruction, Jacques Derrida, post-structuralism, and all of this talk. Existentialism at least had a good idea that we were fallen into the universe, which was a kind of metaphor that sounded a little like a Christian background. But we're fallen into the universe, Heidegger would say, we're here, we only become what we make ourselves. That's Nietzsche's view. We are our self-creators because we come into existence undefined to a great extent, and then we make what we are to a great extent. That led people to believe that he thought we could be in charge of everything, or some supermen would be able to dominate everything. That's a mistaken idea of Nietzsche, who was a very, very humanitarian fellow, despite his strong talk. So the third phase of my effort today is to say that creation without a creator, evolution without a designer, and a mind without a soul. Now this can upset some people, but in fact all I mean is a mind, a human soul that is not immortal. It's a mortal soul that we have, because the mind is an immaterial mind embodied in the material brain, and the mind and the soul have always been thought to be key parts of the self. And the self is not an illusion. Neither is the mind an illusion, nor is the soul an illusion in my picture. Because the self is really the seat of our spirit. We're thought to have, we lose a spirit when we die and so forth. But we do, in fact, lose it, but we have it while we're living. We have a soul, we are selves. And the self also corresponds to the ego, which was a very important idea. Freud made it very famous at the end of the 19th century. But right from that time, the positivists, the empiricists, the materialists, the reductionists, and so-called naturalists that don't want anything that smells supernatural, they've been denying it, really since the early 19th century. Auguste Comte was the first positivist, and he said positivism was sticking to the bare facts that can be seen, verified through experience and through experiment and so forth, and that metaphysics was this area where all these radical ideas were thought about, immaterial selves and souls and all of that, and beyond that, that led to religion. So Comte had these 3 layers, tried to get everyone down to the bottom layer. Ernst Mach was a great follower of these ideas, claimed the ego is an illusion. There's nothing there, just we are bundles of sensations, those are real, but sensations are always not reaching the things themselves, famously. The argument is that the perceptions are what they are, but the color red is not in an object that is red simply because the object absorbs blue and reflects red. It appears red, but red is a qualitative thing the philosophers called a qualia, and there's this great problem in the philosophy of color. Do you see the same color I see? No way to prove that, because we can't get into one another's minds and have one another's experiences. All kind of interesting. That's what's taught in philosophy these days. But for me, it gets a lot simpler when we just restore ideas that there are immaterial minds, souls, selves, a spirit in each of us. And it's even what Gilbert Ryle famously in the mid-20th century called the ghost in the machine, hoping to put a death blow to these ideas as immaterial things that have the potential to change things in the world. And as an information philosopher, I am an idealist philosopher, because ideas are the heart of what it is that makes us human, in my view. I mentioned just a couple more things. The way our knowledge is in our minds, it's because it's stored and recalled in what I call an experience recorder and reproducer that also recalls the emotions, the passions, the feelings, the drives that accompanied any past experiences. It's beyond any computational reasoning system, like today's cognitive scientists who think the brain is a computer, the mind is a computer. And it's beyond mere cognition. It's beyond logic and language. It's the basis for our sentiments, our values, our agency, and ultimately for free will and moral responsibility, as I will try to show, and will, I hope, show with all of my work. I want to basically say very strongly, man is not a machine, and the mind is not a computer. And here's a nice two phrases that really started, and I learned them first in another context from Immanuel Kant, who famously had this expression that, well, as Peirce put it, my American philosopher friend, it's concepts without percepts, without perceptions, are blind, and perceptions without concepts are void, or I guess it's the other way around. In any case, I've turned it into the twin problems of human freedom and human values. And I like to put it in the version that freedom without values is absurd. And the absurd is the phrase that comes to us from existentialists like Sartre and Nietzsche. Continental rational existentialism had this argument that God is dead, humans are absurd, the idea that they have any freedom, where we have freedom but no values, and we're in this absurd situation. And the other phrase I've developed is that values without freedom are useless, and the use refers to the utilitarian notion of the British empiricists, who thought they could establish values, but they were determinists, positivists, empiricists, determinists in a very big way. It seems to me that we've got to have both of these together, freedom with values. So our job, my job as an information philosopher, is to show that information itself can be considered a sort of objective good. And it came into the universe under special conditions which allowed it to escape the second law of thermodynamics, that everything is going to get destroyed in a heat death and so forth. So information came into the universe. And it today is the foundation, the sine qua non, I would say. Without it, without information, there's nothing interesting in the universe. So my work is to base a goodness on that, and then to base the aspect of our creative freedom on a connection with quantum indeterminism and so forth. So thank you very much for this 10th week and the first lecture, the 10th lecture on great problems in philosophy. And I'll be hoping you'll come again tomorrow when we'll talk about a problem in free will. And on Wednesday this week, we'll talk about Bob Kane, who is the leading libertarian philosopher and a friend. But for now, I think I should take you back to my starting screen and watch for the time to run out on my connection with CCTV. Thank you.